This oral history of museum computing is provided by Richard Rinehart and was recorded on the 14th of May, 2021 by Paul Marty and Kathy Jones.
Well, I have a few, take this in the form of notes from the field rather than a sort of biographical narrative. I do want to, again, apologize for being late to our session today, but it did give me cause to reflect because I was late because of a bridge coming down. And while I was frustrated and embarrassed to be late, as I was waiting there, it did occur to me that I was frustrated by the failure of some invisible technology, right? The fact that this bridge was coming down and we don't notice this kind of invisible infrastructure until it fails us. And that was not lost on me as I was waiting for the bridge to come home to jump on the information bridge and being able to talk to you all. And I was kind of, as I was passing the highway workers that were working on getting this bridge up and running too, I sort of felt a kinship in a way. I know what it's like to be one of the Morlocks, down in the subterranean chambers, laboring away at machines whose purpose and impact I perhaps fully don't grasp, but laboring nonetheless in darkness, while the masters above, reap the benefits until we smash the machines. So there's that. But I have just a few stories I'll tell, if that's okay. So way back in the early days, most of these memories come from my long tenure of 17 plus years at the UC Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, right? And I remember, and I started there in 1994. I was actually working across campus in the library for a few years prior. And my job, not coincidentally at the library, was to sit in the basement, and they would ship computers to us. And back in those days, in the early 90s, I'm talking like 91 to 93, you didn't get a nice little computer that was ready to plug in and go, right? You got parts. And you had to assemble the parts, and then you had to program the ROM and all that kind of stuff. You could get computers that were, fully contained, but the library at UC Berkeley chose not to. So I sat in the basement assembling those computers and programming that ROM. Then I went over to the museum, and one of the first projects that I remember in the 90s was that we partnered with Apple Computer, and they were introducing a new device called the Apple Newton. I don't know if that'll ring a bell, but it was a handheld digital, they called it a PDA back in the day. It was the precursor to, of course, these things, right? Only it was 8 times the size of these things, and 1/100th of computing power. Anyway, it had a little black and white screen, but it had multimedia, it had non-linear multimedia capabilities. And so we partnered with them, and my great idea was to turn it into a new form of in-gallery, a walking tour of the museum for visitors, right? About a particular exhibition that we were having. And, if you remember the time, like museums had long had those sort of cassette recorders on a rope that you could hang around your neck. Good one. Wait, I gotta see this. Interesting. Okay, so museums that had those tape recorders, but those were, of course, limited, non-interactive. They were very linear. You sort of had to follow the tour. They were famous for people getting lost and not knowing what painting people were talking about at a given moment, things like that. So I thought, well, this opens up all kinds of possibilities. And I was excited to partner with Apple, which wasn't quite the international behemoth that they are now. They were a big company by then, but they were also kind of in their ups and downs periods, and so they partnered with us because remember, we were both in the Bay Area, so it wasn't that far, to Silicon Valley from Berkeley. And we worked together, the Berkeley Art Museum crew and myself and Apple, to work on these things. And we worked for months. And of course, this was, sort of invisible behind the scenes, like, very few other people knew what we were working on. Of course, Apple wanted it to be super secret because they were going to kind of use the event to promote the multiple uses for this new handheld digital device that would transform the world, Trick is, they were ahead of their time, because when we unveiled the project to our public, and in fact, we made it free and did everything, we trained the docents on sort of how to use it so that they could answer questions and train the visitors. But the bottom line was, for all of that effort and all of that glorious vision, it was a big flop. It just went over like a lead balloon with the visitors. And it was, I think, primarily because people just weren't used to having this kind of a thing yet. people weren't used to holding a computer in your hand and having some sort of interface, the tape recording thing was frustrating enough for a lot of visitors who got lost. And I think we were just asking for too much for people too soon, right? Because if you're not used to this technology out in the world, and then you step into the museum and they throw this thing in front of you that is so alien that you've never seen it, it's too far advanced to have even appeared on Space Odyssey, 2001, there's just no familiarity with it, So it almost is like one of the lessons that I learned many lessons from that, about piloting small, pilot and iterate instead of sort of building up your big project and putting too much energy into it, especially if it's not something that you're going to commit to permanently. And this was definitely an experiment. And I credit Berkeley and the Berkeley Art Museum for having that experimental, innovative spirit, for many years. In fact, they still do. So that was one of the big lessons from the failed Apple Newton project, was just, once the thing is out there in the world, it's a lot easier to introduce it, into the museum setting. Now, the exception to that is, of course, artists. Artists, of course, innovate, and new media artists innovate with technology, and they do weird and kooky things, and they're usually years ahead of their time in terms of interface design, and also social uses of media, unexpected sort of uses and critiques of new media in the art space. But I sort of feel like the museum audiences are sort of prepared to be challenged by the artworks. They're not necessarily as prepared to be challenged by the sort of invisible furniture of the museum itself. The things that the museum's whole purpose is to make it easier to engage with these, crazy advanced artworks. And by us being too innovative on our side, we weren't making it easier. We were just challenging them from the first go. So, once these things got in the public, and then of course museums started to take up that technology, it took off. And that was a big lesson for me. And moreover, I have to say, I really did learn from my failures. Maybe they stuck in my brain more because we all are wired to want to succeed, so maybe my failures stuck out for me more. But I think as I got older, I realized, it actually is valuable to learn from your failures. There's no bad information. You can, of course, waste resources, and that's never a good thing. But as long as you have a good goal, and you're learning from what you're doing, that seems to be the important thing. So the next project that I undertook was I was curating the aforementioned new media art at the UC Berkeley Art Museum, and I talked them into letting me curating a wholly online net art series of exhibitions, an ongoing portal for net art. And indeed, I perhaps not that creatively called it net art. And that was the portal of the UC Berkeley Art Museum website. And it was an exhibition stream of our curated exhibitions, a series. And in my mind, one of the innovations that I wanted to propel with that, and which I was successful for a period, was that the new media artists who showed on there would show a work of new media art on the website. And we would, I would gather some contextual texts, and then I would usually do a video interview, kind of just like this, actually, with the artist, and that would accompany the artwork for context. So we were exhibiting the art, and we were doing what museums do well, provide the context for things. But the extra thing that I wanted to do that really hadn't been done too much at that time was that I got the artists to agree that after their exhibition, it was usually about 2 months, they would allow the source files for their digital art project to be uploaded to the same site and made freely available to the public under Creative Commons licenses. So they could be, of course, as restrictive or as open as they wanted to be with these things. And of course, I was open when I approached the artists for this project. I said, part of this project is you exhibit your art, and then part 2 is you give it away, And so it wasn't like, so the artists who came on board were ones who wanted to participate in this. And they gave away the source file, the SWF flash files and things like that, the original images, any bit of coding they had done, sort of whatever was behind the artwork. And the idea was that not only could people experience the artwork, but and it wasn't about people downloading it to own it. It was about people sort of being able to reverse engineer an artwork and use it as part of the infrastructure for their own work. And then we even had a system built in where if somebody used a piece of one of these new media artworks in their own artwork or their own non-art creation, part of the requirement was that they would register it back so that we could start to create this kind of growing tree of, the artwork began here and has since spoked out here, and it's been, and since there are more sophisticated tools for that sort of thing, right? But that's what we were attempting to do, is to trace the influence of the artwork and the spread. And that was, I think it was a wonderful sort of aspirational gesture of open culture. I think anybody who remembers sort of the early 2000s probably remembers that, for a period, every computer-related conference was titled open this, open that. Everything was open, right? Open source, open community, open X. So we were kind of there, and being a public, university, I think it was within our ethos to do something like that. And there were problems with it, of course. Like now, I would be, I think now I would be more critical about what compensation the artist was getting. And I would probably try and make it such that it wasn't, like so much of a gig economy, and make it so that the museum up front would compensate the artist more significantly, so that there any sort of loss that they might have from giving away their code would be compensated for by a public institution whose responsibility is to support artists, right? And to, support sharing a culture. So I would see it within the writ of a public museum to do something like that. Anyway, that wasn't part of the project then, but that's what I learned. And I have to say, one of the hardest lessons that I learned with that is that the program went on for years, and it was, I thought it was really fun. And there were some interesting projects that were opened up and reinterpreted in interesting ways. And then when I left the institution, they didn't fill my position. It was a hard financial time, so I understand why they didn't do that. But essentially, there was no institutional pickup of that initiative or of a lot of initiatives. And so while I don't really fault the institution, it was sort of the aftermath of the 2009 financial crunch, so I sort of get why institutions had to sort of retract and entrench after that, and in fact are still kind of retrenching. One of the other lessons that I learned is just how much innovation, if I can go ahead and say that, comes from an individual evangelist in an institution pushing for something. And then when that person leaves, that leaves, or that just stops, So you have this really sort of staccato rhythm of institutional innovation, like Steve Dietz goes to the Walker Art Center and boom, it's the center of the digital art world. And then he's gone. And then, the brakes are on. And like that whole, so that institution had a real moment there. And there were other people involved too, of course. So yeah, that was the lesson for me, is it's not so much about institutions as personalities. And to my mind, that's not a good place to be. I mean, I'm happy that the institutions allow, for that kind of rapid change and that kind of experimentation on the one hand. On the other hand, I sort of feel like as institutions, especially long-term cultural heritage institutions, we should all be forward thinking and thinking in terms of sort of interoperability and sustainability, right? Not only in terms of our sort of, green footprint on the earth, but of our information technology projects too, and if it's not going to be taken up, if it's not scalable, and not everything should be, some things are just experiments, but it did leave me questioning sort of the role of the institution. What's the obligation of the institution in these scenarios, besides, providing the time for the individual to do this and the resources, which is no small thing, right? The willingness to experiment is great, but I sort of wonder about that, the conversation between the individual and the institution. And it's perhaps fitting that I left that position to become the director of a small museum, the Samick Art Museum at Bucknell University. And so I brought that institutional question with me when I came. It's sort of like, okay, what's the institution's responsibility here? Even if I or somebody else on staff innovates and creates some terrific experiment, what is the institution's responsibility afterwards? And can we say that up front or not? I don't know. It was just a question for me that really stuck in my head. Another project that I will talk about is the media art notation system. So I've been involved in the collection and preservation of new media art for quite a while, decades now, I guess. And was working with the Guggenheim and Franklin Furnace and other good institutions on a couple of grant-funded projects. Archiving the avant-garde comes to mind as one of them. So we got grant funding from the NEA and the NEH and the IMLS over the years to fund these kind of projects. So we were looking at the problem of preserving and collecting digital art from all levels, from the culture of the institutions and the museums that were collecting and what needed to change in terms of professional education, professional practices, institutional infrastructure and policy, all the way through the technological aspects of the question, naturally, including metadata. And it was a real time when there were a lot of metadata schemas and standards being formulated, and there was a real sort of blooming of awareness about metadata and the role of it. And now, of course, that is a truly invisible technology. But as you both probably remember, there was a time when a lot of us were thinking very, very openly about that. And that's where a lot of museum conferences would be focused. So I was involved, for instance, partly because I was at UC Berkeley. Daniel Pitti over in the library was developing the EAD, the encoded archival description, which has now become an institutional international standard for the description of finding aids in archives. But where was I going with that? But so I was involved in metadata from early on, and I was sort of trying to bring a museum perspective to things. But what that meant is, since Daniel brought me in to work in that really kind of library and really archive-centric kind of a thing, I also worked with people in the UC Berkeley Library. Remember, I used to work there before the museum, so I had those connections. And a lot of the projects that we were doing, like MOAC, Museums and the Online Archive of California, purposefully involved museums, archives, and libraries, where we were trying to hit really the triad, the eternal triad of cultural heritage, to get everybody involved and get everything to be interoperable. So I saw a lot of these standards, were coming from the library world, because the library world had a longer history of developing these kind of standards, like with the MARC library format and others. And the library world is much, much bigger than the museum world. And I was really interested from the museum side of things in making, first of all, not being so competitive as museums traditionally, are for a number of financial reasons, and also working with libraries and archives to develop interoperable standards. It just made sense, because the world of libraries is so much bigger, and the world of library vendors was bigger too. So I wanted to be able to, as a museum professional, be able to tap into and use library standards and library tools, right? Because those are going to be better supported, cheaper, more, there's probably going to be more diversity of them, given the market is so much bigger. And for so many other reasons, I wanted to be able to discover cultural heritage data and share it behind the scenes, and discover it on the other side from a public perspective, sort of seamlessly, if possible, right? That's still the dream, and it's definitely happening. So at that point, when we were talking about preserving digital art, the conversation naturally went toward, well, here's some metadata schema we should use. Maybe we should use CDOC, or maybe we should use, any of the others that were popping out at the time, the EAD for that matter. And the more I looked into it, despite my own proclivity for interoperability, I thought, there are so many things that are different about new media art than, a sort of digital textual resource, or, the other kinds of things that archives were mostly dealing with. Artworks are just different kinds of cultural artifacts. I suppose that's why there's a specialized kind of institution to care for them, right? Because they're different enough that they require that kind of consideration. So I thought, we can't just slap on, despite the fact that library metadata is the 800-pound gorilla, and museums are really the small fry here, and that we shouldn't just sort of uncritically apply these library technologies and metadata standards onto our own needs for new media art. Now, that's not to say that we should just invent our own and do our own thing either. Like, going rogue has its own pitfalls. So I thought, well, what we should do probably is take, a broader computer industry and or library standard and adapt it and tweak it in certain ways. So I set about writing a metadata schema called the Media Art Notation System. And I published in Leonardo, the journal Leonardo, and a couple of places about it. And it was a metadata schema intended to describe works of interactive multimedia, new media art for the purposes of access, but also for preservation. And one of my main intentions with the media art notation system was really a kind of as a proof of concept, because what I wanted to do was be able to talk in great detail and with a great granularity about exactly the kinds of metadata approaches are needed for new media art, and moreover, how these might be different than the metadata needs of other types of cultural materials. And I think one of the things that I learned from that is I wrote it, and then I wrote these papers detailing it and put it out there into the world. And I think for my own part, I saw it as a proof of concept, but perhaps I wasn't clear enough about that in the delivery. So I think it was put out there as if it were a standard meant to be taken up and adopted. And it wasn't really adopted that widely. I mean, some people, I noticeably there was somebody in England who tried to implement it inside of a digital asset management system that I thought was very interesting. But it was, again, really meant as this kind of proof of concept. And it was an adaptation of the MPEG standard, MPEG 21. So not the video compression standard, but the video metadata standard, which was really complex. But I thought, if I just adapt it, and I'm not breaking any piece of it, right? But I'm adapting it and documenting the special ways in which I'm using this or that, tag or field in such a way that I'm creating a metadata schema that's really, if you create it and put it out there, it's MPEG compatible, So I thought, okay, well, this is great stuff. And it was successful in that it demonstrated to people who speak metadata, it demonstrated, I think, the special needs of new media art. And I often refer to it for that purpose. But I think one of the lessons I learned from it, though, is one has to be very intentional about the intended role of, a schema or a project. So going into any sort of project, I'm sorry, I'm pausing now because my calendar is popping up with all kind of pop-ups for me. One needs to be very intentional about the purpose and scope, I would say, of an intended project. I think that would have helped us with the Apple Newton project as well, if we had sort of said, okay, this is just going to be a one-off. We're going to take 6 months, we're going to do this, we're going to do it at this scale, and if it fails, then here's what we're going to do with that information. If it succeeds, then we'll do version 2, So I think the same would have been true of the media art notation system. It would have been good to, for me, I think, to think through more clearly, okay, this is not like the EAD. I'm not stitching something from whole cloth that I'm going to push out there into the world as ready-made to go. It really was a proof of concept. So that's quite a different thing. So that was a lesson to me in terms of project conceptualization and management. The last thing I think I want to mention is the installation and manifestation and creation of the UC Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive website. So we made the website, which launched in 1994 when I got there. And I remember when I first got to the museum, and it was the year that I got there, right? And I had just come from the library, and I was some whippersnapper and didn't know anything or anybody. And I said I think at a staff meeting or something, I said, I'd like to create a website for this museum. I think that'd be a great way to reach the public. And of course, everybody's like, web, what? What's a web, And so I had to do that. But I also remember there was one other person on staff in communications who said, oh, we already have plans for that. I have detailed plans for a Gopher site. So we're making the Gopher site for the museum. And I said, well, that's great. We can have 2 sites, but I sort of feel like this HTTP and HTML protocols, the way to go. Let's try that. And I have to say that nobody was into it. It was just this thing that wasn't on anybody's radar. And they're like, what is this crazy thing? What are you doing? And there was one curator in particular who said, yeah, why don't we make it for this exhibition I'm doing? Because I just want to do this thing, And again, so it was one of those things where the institution was only peripherally involved. In fact, largely unaware of what we were doing. And we launched the website. And over the years, on my various combings through of history, I think it was probably among the first 10 museum websites developed in the world. So it was pretty early in there. And I remember a couple of the other ones, because the first one, the first website for a museum, for an actual real physical museum, might have been the Museum of Paleontology at UC Berkeley. And so it's no coincidence. So you're confirming that. I think that was an early one, if not the first, right? So he was on campus. It was a grad student who started it for them without their knowledge either. So we were sort of, simpatico with that, but I was able to draw on that expertise. Moreover, though, I think maybe, and this, I invite anyone to correct or document this history, because this is just anecdotal. And I remember the Web Louvre might be the first museum website. Now, the reason I said paleontology was the first real museum website is Le Web Louvre wasn't started by the Louvre at all, or anybody working for the Louvre, right? It was a grad student unaffiliated with the museum, Nicolas Pioche, and he started this thing on his own. And he was just using images that he could scan or grab from anywhere of works in the Louvre. So I think that might have been the first museum website, which was kind of illegitimate. And then the Museum of Paleontology at Berkeley was the first real one. And then the Berkeley Art Museum might have been, in the top 10, or certainly it was one of the early ones. But it was, of course, interesting to me, again, too, how we started this under the radar. Like, we were the Morlocks and we were building our own machines, and nobody knew up above, what we were doing until it came out. And it turned out to be, quite a useful tool. I do remember one little anecdote about Nicolas Pioche, because, we people developing those early museum websites, since there's only a handful early on, we all knew each other, right? And we're communicating. And I remember at a certain point, the Louvre became aware of Le Web Louvre that Nicolas had built. And apparently they were not pleased. And so they were going through the French Minister of Culture to take action against him, because he was a grad student. And first of all, of course, they wanted the website to stop and go away. And then maybe there'd be some punitive action against him because he had used their name and their images and all this kind of stuff. And so he asked me to write a letter of defense on his behalf to the French Minister of Culture. And I thought, yeah, me. I'm sure that's who he's going to listen to. But, why not? I was going to help out. Poor Nicholas. I thought he did something really interesting, and here he might, in the end, be punished for it. So I wrote the letter to the Minister of Culture in France. And my main point of advice was, I said, look, I get it. I get that the web, the Louvre probably should have been involved in this and hasn't been. I said, but instead of the Louvre punishing this guy, they should hire him. Really, he's already done the work for them and he knows what he's doing. The website was extensive. And I was like, you take advantage of this kind of grassroots initiative, right? And grab onto it instead of stamping down on it, setting the work back years and then starting over again, which is what they did in the end, I think. Anyway, I never got a response from the French Minister of Culture. I don't know whether he ever read the letter or not. I never expected him to. But I just remember the scene back then of us building those websites for museums in the early days, and how we talked to each other, and sort of the little stories that we shared about those early beginnings, and the idea of when the web became aware of Nicholas and I had to write that letter. That stuck in my brain too. That was a little moment in, I don't know, cultural technology history, that probably nobody knows about. I've since moved from the Berkeley Art Museum, where I had a more specialized role focusing on technology, to being the director of the Samick Art Museum, which is a small academic museum that is sort of fully formed and full functioning, right? We do everything that a traditional museum does. Just, I call us the mini Met of Central PA. And we are the biggest museum within a 50-mile radius. But what I was going to say is, I sort of miss the days of being a specialist. I'm now a generalist. And I was a specialist for so many years. And when I think back on what I miss the most, it's really the camaraderie. It's really these connections that we were talking about and the names that you're bringing up. And my days with, both of you at the MCN and the Museum Computer Network were just really fun. And I remember at a certain point in my career, probably at the end of the 90s, the early 2000s, when I was involved with MCN and larger museum community. And I was teaching at UC Berkeley, and I sort of faced a split in my career where I thought, I could probably teach and do new media art and go the academic route and, take up a teaching role. I had guest taught at a bunch of Bay Area colleges and everything. And the one most influential factor that took me in the other route, the route of staying within museums, was I thought at the end of the day, I thought, you know what? I like museum people better. I like going to museum conferences and hanging out with them better. They're actually much more fun than CAA. I love CAA. I go to CAA now. You know, I mean, it's obviously well crossover, but you probably get where I'm coming from, right? I would go to MCM, and even if we met up at AAM, we'd go after the day's, you know, worth of seminars, and we'd go to the hotel bar and have some drinks and talk about metadata standards and, you know, transfer protocols and all the stuff that you're documenting, all this invisible technology. Somebody should have been recording all of those those hotel bars, you know, in the like early 2000s, and you would have captured all the history that you're trying to recreate here after the fact.
Maybe we'll do that next.
There you go. So I really appreciate you doing this, because that's what I miss the most. And I just want to sort of hang that up on histories, you know, pinboard as well, that I feel like there was a real spirit of community and collaboration during that period. And it was really special.